All right. Can folks hear us?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you for joining. This is my name is Ashar Rizqi, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Blameless, and welcome to the first ever Blameless SLO Workshop. We also have Christina Tan here.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm from the Blameless content team, and I've interviewed SRE thought leaders from companies like Evernote, Twilio, LinkedIn, Google, and Uber, and really excited to share the insights I've learned from them with you guys today.
All right. So today we're going to be going over three main topics in our discussion. We're going to introduce the principles and concepts behind SLOs and error budgets. We'll go through a real-world example of setting effective SLIs and SLOs. We'll look at some real-life applications. And finally, we'll end with a discussion on some advanced SLO practices that we've kind of seen through our own perspectives, our own experiences, as well as from the field and talking to a bunch of other practitioners of SLOs out there.
Oh.
Great, so let's just dive right in.
So what is an SLO? I'm sure many of you have heard the term SLA, and more recently, all of these terms have been getting thrown around: SLAs, SLOs, SLI. So as you can see, SLA stands for service level agreement. Those are the legal contracts that your company signs with your customers. And SLO stands for service level objective. And that is an internal target that measures customer experience, which we'll get into more details later. The third one is SLI. I stands for indicator. And SLI is the name for the target, or the definition. How do you measure the metric? And you'll also see examples of that. So as you can see where the dotted line is, customers only see SLA. Therefore, it only makes sense that when you're measuring your internal metrics, you don't want to hit the SLA before you hit the SLO. So more often, always SLOs are a more stringent target than SLA. Now, if your SLA is at 4 nines, 99.99% availability or uptime, then your SLO is strictly, apologies for the example. This is an example of a poorly set SLO. So the two numbers should be switched. If your SLA is at 99.99%, then your SLO wants to be more stringent at 99.99%. And typically, if you think about an SLA, you see it on the Amazon cloud contract. And this is a number that's typically put into the contract by the legal team or the sales team. And the SLA is typically set internally. Sorry, the SLO is typically set internally. Now, SLOs are really interesting because they allow you to catch issues before you hit your SLA, and they represent the expectations of your users. We're going to talk about what makes it so valuable to other people, and in the next slide. So this is a way of visualizing SLOs. It can be tricky to understand what SLI is once you see a more detailed definition. So think of it as the axis of what you're measuring, whereas SLO is the target. It's a linear one number that you're trying to hit. It's a threshold that measures how happy your customers are. Because oftentimes the problem is not because reliability problems are not from moving too fast. It's from not knowing how fast to move. We think that in order to stay competitive with our competition, we need to be shipping features all the time. But really, reliability is all of your existing features combined. And so making sure that customers are happy with how you're delivering everything that you've shipped so far is important. And doing too much actually hurts your organization. So SLO, really the goal is to help you balance the feature development velocity and your product's reliability. Now, why SLOs? SLOs allow you to have your cake and eat it too. You can move fast and still be reliable by not being too reliable or slowing down too much for your reliability. How it benefits operations developers and product managers and engineering managers. Now let's see what pains they suffer. So I think as operations people, it's a very powerless position to be in, where it can be very discouraging when you have no control or influence over how the code that you're deploying gets developed. And for developers, they're scared because when they push code, they think, oh my God, is this going to bring down the service? And for project managers, they know reliability is important, but how important is it? If the PM is trying to rank reliability relative to all the other features, how are they going to prioritize it? Well, SLO is the answer to that. SLO enables operations people to feel safe that even when there is outages, it's okay because you're not dipping below your SLO yet. So your customers are still happy, even if you have incidents. And for developers, you can ship as many features as you want, as long as you stay within the SLO. And once you hit the SLO and dip below, then maybe that's time to start working on some of the reliability action items. And for the PMs, they can see that as long as we're still satisfying the SLO, then we can continue to push features. But as soon as that gets violated, now it's time to prioritize reliability.
Yeah, the thing I want to add to that is because you and your product teams have to maintain this budget collectively, it becomes a common incentive for those folks to come together and own it, right? So it encourages this model of you build it, you run it, and service ownership. And that's what really helps strike that balance between moving fast and slowing down whenever you need to. Right? It's also a way, and what we've seen across a lot of companies, it becomes a way for the development teams, the product teams to self-regulate, self-manage themselves, and that frees up the operations and SRE teams to work on higher value initiatives. So let's talk about some principles behind SLOs. I'm sure many folks here have heard from management that we need to be 100% available. Well, 100% availability is the wrong reliability target. And here's a few problems that we've seen by having, why having 100% SLO is actually bad for you. If you're trying to run your service much more reliably than it needs to be, you're going to be slowing down development velocity for features that only make you so much more reliable, only so much more happiness, brings only so much more happiness to your customers. And that minor increase in reliability is not necessarily moving the needle for your business, right? If you are too reliable, then your users will actually come to rely on that, right? Get extremely frustrated, unhappy when you have the slightest blip in unavailability or slightest blip in reliability. There isn't actually a linear relationship between service availability and user happiness, right? There isn't any data indicating that the more service availability you have, the happier your users are going to be. And this is actually pretty prevalent example when in the ISP world, when you're connecting to the internet. It doesn't really matter how fast your internet connection is if your Wi-Fi, if your router is actually going down all the time. Okay. And once you've passed the happiness test, increasing availability only has diminishing returns for you. Any additional 9 of uptime or availability you try to go after actually has an exponential cost associated with it. And what that also means is that it reduces your ability to make any sort of changes. So 100% availability is just something not realistic. There aren't that many natural or unnatural systems in the world that actually have 100% availability. Okay. So let's actually talk about what this means. Let's talk about this concept of error budgets in a little bit. But what I wanted to demonstrate here is what do typical numbers, SLOs for availability look like? So you've probably seen 95%, 2 nines, 3, 4, 5 nines. Well, from a error budget perspective, error budget is 1 minus SLO. And from an error budget perspective, 5 nines is only 24 seconds of unavailability that you can actually have, right? So the question I have for folks here is, are you set up as a system internally, as a team, as an organization to actually respond, not only respond, but recover within that 24-second time frame within a month, and then do that consistently over a particular time frame, right? The error budget is really telling us how unreliable our service is actually allowed to be. And you can think of it as almost like a monthly personal financial budget that you can use to spend on certain things. And obviously, when you have a budget, overspending is actually going to hurt you, right? And it's the same concept that actually applies to the error budget in the SLO domain. Within this realm, the error budget is available to you to spend on things like rolling out new features or downtime windows for maintenances, or any type of inevitable failure that's going to happen, not only in hardware, well, in today's world, it's all in the cloud, or the fact that your applications are not only dependent on internal APIs, but external APIs as well.
A good rule of thumb is that if every month you have an incident that takes people more than 30 minutes to resolve, you probably don't want to go for 5 nines from the get-go. And you're probably looking at 2 nines or even 95%. And oftentimes people have the misconception that this downtime means continuous downtime. But no, if you spread this out across 28 days, it could be barely noticeable to the user. And then within the day, you can split it by the hour. And so that could be just a few seconds of downtime per the hour.
Yeah. And thinking from a culture perspective, the kind of culture you want to build inside your organization. So you could have a siloed culture and not much ownership around this error budget. Or you could have a culture of shared ownership around this owner budget, where the product teams, along with operations and engineers, all have to collectively maintain this budget. And it becomes an incentive for everybody. It's the collective incentive for everybody to come together. And this is what really helps strike that balance between moving fast or slowing down. And again, product teams can then use this to self-regulate. They don't need to have gates in the middle or teams that are blocking them. This SLO, this error budget, just gives it empowers the product teams to make those move fast and not break things decision by themselves.
An error budget can translate into a culture term too. So one of the best things we've heard is to err is human. So sometimes if I make a mistake, then my teammate will say, it's okay, you're still within your error budget. And that's really made me feel more safe to make mistakes, do more adventurous things, but still succeed.
Okay, great. So now that we've talked about the core concepts and principles behind SLOs and error budgets and why they're important, and hopefully folks that are in this room have really bought into and have understood the importance of having SLOs, let's actually go into the exercise portion of our workshop today. Okay, so let's start with some basics. Google has spent a lot of time and effort actually talking about these concepts. So, we're going to be rehashing some of those here as part of this workshop. So the first concept within this notion of setting up a good SLO and SLI is the SLI equation, right? SLIs should be expressed as a ratio of 2 numbers. That is good events divided by valid events. And we'll talk a little bit about what's a good event and what's a valid event. And another way of actually stating this is the proportion, the SLI is the proportion of valid events that were good. So the question we ask ourselves is, why is this actually helpful to us? Right? Well, when you're expressing your SLI in this format, it falls between 0% and 100% number. 0% means that nothing is working, and 100% means that nothing is broken, right? And the other benefit that you have of talking about SLIs in this type of formula is that it gives you consistency, and you can start mapping out an abstraction on top of this formula, which then helps you in terms of automation, in terms of tooling, in terms of defining what your SLOs are going to be. Okay, going back to what is an example of a valid versus a successful event. Sometimes you may need to completely exclude some events recorded in your monitoring system to avoid consuming that error budget. It's not a valid event if a user is not even experiencing that event. So a valid event is what is the user experience going to be and the expression of that user experience. So in a HTTP or request response type application, 200s or any type of 400 response or 500 response are all user visible. So you want to consider them as valid responses, right? The specific successful criteria that we really care about is maybe the number of 200s or 200 OKs that our users are getting. An example of an invalid request could be a 301 or some sort of gateway moving from one spot to another, which the user is not necessarily going to see, but the client on the browser side is just going to be taking care of that for you. So that may not necessarily be a valid event for us. The second concept here is this notion of SLI. How do we reason? How do we come up with a quantifiable, observable system that we can then use to determine what actually needs to be measured, right? So there's three high-level categories. There are more categories that are emerging, but three high-level categories in which your applications will actually generally fall into. So you've got your request and response time applications, you've got data processing applications, and then you've got storage applications, right? Within those, for the purposes of this discussion, we're only going to cover request and response type applications. And within that, we're going to talk about availability and latency.
And as you can see, all of these can be a representation of the user experience. And that is a really important thing to keep in mind, because we don't want to be measuring CPU load that actually doesn't affect the user experience. Okay, great. So let's actually talk about these two types of SLIs within this request response type application. Let's talk about availability. It's very common. The availability of a system is a very critical reliability measure, as we all know, right? When something's not available, we don't consider it to be reliable, right? And if it's not responding, if your application is not responding successfully, you can safely assume that your users are actually unhappy and it's not meeting their expectations of reliability. Yeah. The availability SLI can be specified as the proportion of valid requests served successfully. Right? And going back to what we talked about before, you must choose what you consider to be valid and what is your definition of success, right? Definition of success, as we talked about, could be a 200 response okay. The latency of a system is actually an equally important reliability measure, right? If requests are not responding to the user within a given time frame, it is not considered to be reliable. And your users will actually start to leave your system to go to another one that is much more reliable, much faster responding. Right? And the latency SLI can be specified as the proportion of valid requests served faster than a certain threshold. Right? There's a study done by Google a long time ago. It gets touted in many different conversations that if it takes anything longer than 100 milliseconds, a lot of times people will get from 100 milliseconds, there's 900 milliseconds, some range between there where people will start to get frustrated and will actually leave your system. Great. So now let's actually go into the exercise of developing an SLI and SLO. As you can see, it's a 4-step process. The first one being mapping out a critical user journey. So before we actually do any SLI, SLO setting, we want to know what are the things that the user is trying to accomplish through your product. And then number 2 is choose an SLI specification, then refine the spec into an implementation. Where are you going to do this? And set SLOs based on past performance or business metrics.
Great. So let's actually look at a very simple but real-life example, real-life application that a lot of folks here will interact with. You may have used Dropbox or Box or Google Drive, right? And the experience that we're trying to get from there is being able to download a file through your browser from some sort of cloud storage provider in the back. So what you're seeing here is that our user is looking to download a file stored in the cloud. They will push the download button in their web browser. That request is going to hit a load balancer, which is sitting in front of a farm of download API servers. And that download API servers is likely running some type of download application, right, which has the business logic built in to determine where the file is and how to find it and how to actually serve it. Right? So that download API application will actually talk to the database, look at where that file is stored, and then go to the relevant storage system, and then the download API server will actually serve that file to the web browser, to the user directly. Okay, so step number 1, let's select a user journey. In this case, it's actually quite obvious. What is the user trying to accomplish here? Well, they're trying to download a file. So selecting a user journey is as simple as explicitly stating, what is my user trying to do? Step 2, which is how do we now, once we know what the user journey is and what our user is trying to do, how do we actually go into defining the specification for the SLI, right? The spec has actually 3 components associated with it, and we've covered some of these. The first one is the type. whether it's an availability SLI or latency SLI. And as we've mentioned, there are other categories, but we're just going to focus on these two for today. The spec has an actual event. Like how is that user action actually represented inside our system? And then the final thing that we have as part of the SLI spec is the success criteria. So in the example that we're showing you here, the type of this request is that it's an availability SLI. And the way that we want to specify it or talk about it very explicitly is the proportion of HTTP GET file download request. So the file download request is the event. And the success criteria is that have 200, 300, or 400 response codes. Okay, step 3, the SLI implementation itself. So the implementation takes the spec and moves it to the next level and says, in addition to defining the event and the success criteria, it's really important for us to understand where in that user journey, that user cycle, that event is actually taking place, right? Where will we actually be measuring success? Is it at the browser layer? Is it at the download API layer? Or is it at the storage layer? And you can refine and iterate over this to understand if there are any gaps in your user journey, and then go back and modify your SLI spec based on that. So in this example, what we're going to say is the proportion of HTTP GET file download requests that have been served 200, 300, or 400 responses as measured from the download API server. And the reason why we've selected the download API server for this example is that if the download API server is unavailable or has a lot of latency, then that's going to directly impact our user's experience. Great. Now we get to the fun part. What do we actually set as an SLO? And what we found is that it's a mix of some sort of, we want to look at some empirical data. So it's it's scientific enough, but there's also an aspect of using your own judgment to really figure out what is the correct objective that we want to set, right? From day one, you're not going to be able to come in and say, oh, my SLO is 4 nines and 5 nines. What you're going to realize is that it's likely that it's incorrect, but it may be within a certain range, right? What we recommend, folks, is that you select a target based on past data, if you have it. And if you don't have past data, use your instinct to really understand, set an achievable SLO and start measuring against it so that you can get some historical data. Right? The second component that's really important within an SLO is the time frame. Are we tracking this SLO over a year, over a month, over 6 months? What we recommend and what Google recommends is that you specify a time frame of 28 days because it lines itself really well as 4 weeks. So the example SLO that we're going to set is 99% of HTTP GET download requests in the last 28 days served that have 200, 300, or 400 response codes. Right? That becomes your SLO. It's an explicit statement of what it is that we're trying to measure. And from that, we can then get an error budget and move on. Great. So this is just a recap. Developing an SLI and its SLO. Step number 1, map out a critical user journey. Choose an SLI specification like the type, event, success criteria. Take that specification and convert it into an implementation. That is, where and how is the success or failure recorded? And then set your SLOs based on past performance or what your business needs are.
As you can see, SLI is the name, the definition, and SLO is the target. Great.
So the question then comes up is like, what can we actually do to represent this in real life? Well, you can actually have a spreadsheet. What we've seen is many folks will use spreadsheets to actually define what their SLIs are, their user journeys are, what the SLIs are that they're trying to track, and what the SLOs are. So spreadsheets are a great mechanism. Obviously, those are hard to keep track of, hard to scale. The other mechanism is obviously Confluence. People will put something into a wiki page, right? And the onus or the ownership of maintaining and tracking that is on the person that's actually defining that SLI. Right? What we're showing you here is just something that we've seen. What we've done recently is we can sitting on top of your existing monitoring stack, such as Datadog or New Relic or whatever system you have in place, and then defining the SLI specification and then tracking that SLO over time, right? And there's a lot of interesting insights that come into play, like how am I performing right now? Can I take a look back at the last 6 months of my performance or my month performance to really understand, am I trending up in my SLO performance or am I trending down in my SLO performance? Or is a particular team in a quarterly timeframe doing really well with their SLOs or really poorly with their SLOs? And what that usually means is, are they using too much or too little of their error budget, which then translates into, are they empowered to move fast or not? Another question that we get asked is, what is the right number of SLIs and SLOs per product area or by user journey? Well, this is something that, this is some data that we've heard from the field. There are companies that we've talked to that have upwards of 700 SLOs. And what they've done is they've set SLO recommend folks is to pull back from that view a little bit, look at things a little bit more holistically, and really, again, focus on that user journey. What is the right number of SLOs? The answer is that it really depends. Depends on your application, depends on how complex your application. We recommend that you start somewhere in the 5 to 10, maybe a little higher region in terms of defining these SLOs per product area. Iterate over those SLOs, and you will end up coming down to roughly a number that's close to 5 SLOs for a particular product area. Great. Tip number 2 from the field. Only set SLIs that reflect user experience, right? CPU utilization on the front-end load balancer, memory utilization on a back-end API server are not SLIs, are not the correct SLIs. Those can be important metrics in the aggregate, but they are not reflecting your users' experiences. The world that we live in today with microservices, container orchestration technologies, event-driven architectures, the CPU utilization concept in terms of applying an SLO on it does not apply anymore. I think it's a collective aggregate experience for your customer.
And that concludes the section on the SLI and SLOs. Before we dive into our third and final section, which is 5 advanced SLO practices, what we're gonna do is we'll do an activity with everyone here to set the tone for the third section of the workshop. So please grab your phone, take your phone out and just go to kahoot.it on your phone browser. And you can leave this webinar open, nothing needs to change. I'll give you 20 seconds to do that. Take out your phone and go to kahoot.it. We have a quiz with concepts that we presented so far. Okay, now that you're on kahoot.it, we will share with you the game ID in just a second. Can everyone see the screen on our end? Can everyone see the Kahoot screen?
Yes.
Yes? Okay, great. Now please input your PIN on your phone, 676162. Pick a nickname for yourself. The funniest wins the first part. Yay! I know we have 30 participants, so we will be waiting for you.
Wow, I love Walrus. Dr. Spenlove, that's probably my favorite.
Miles Salsa, I love salsa.
Quack Overflow, yes, thank you. Sign me up.
Slow-mo, all right.
Should we give it another?
Well, should we wait for more? Oh,
a few more seconds.
Nice. Oh,
almost there.
10. Not yes. 8, 7, 5. Okay, we should be good. 4.
Jesus.
3, 2, 1. Okay, you guys got it. Let's get started. Are you ready? We have 4 questions. Very, very tough. What is not a purpose of SLOs? Now you'll see 4 options on the screen and then tap the corresponding answer on your phone. Not a purpose of SLOs.
You can't change your answers, can you?
No, you cannot change your answer. Is it align interests of DevOps, Ops, and product? Is it balance features, development speed, feature development speed, and reliability? Oh, hey, good job. That is phenomenal. Let's see how we did. Okay, so this app also measures how quickly you responded. So Chris was able to respond the fastest among everyone who got the answer right.
Come on, Dr. Spenlove, I want you to win the next one.
And SLO God, I'm cheering for you. All right, next question. What is the first step to picking a good SLI? Is it set SLO target? Is it define user journey? Is it listening to Beyonce? That's my answer. Is it define success criteria and valid events? Oh, don't get indecisive. Yeah, wow, that's really good.
Oh, so Chris, winning again. Dr. Spenlove, goes second.
Question 3, what is this? 99.99% of profile page load requests served successfully over the last 28 days. Is it my LinkedIn tagline? Is it an SLA? Is it an SLO? Is it an SLI? Spice up the music. Don't get indecisive. You know the answer. Dun, dun.
All right.
Yeah, so because SLO is a target, you can see that reaching 99.99% typically is an indicator that it's an SLO. The rest is the SLI definition, but whenever you see a target, you know that it's an SLO. Great. Oh, well, we'll see who wins. What is not a component of SLI specifications? Is it SLI type, target performance, success criteria, or valid events?
Ooh, this is hard.
Oh, thought about it really hard. Who's gonna be the winner? The suspense builds. 3 more answers. Oh, all right, good job. This is amazing. So since target is part of the SLO, it's not a component of SLI specifications. All right, let's see how we did. All the way.
Wow.
Artie stole gold from So Chris and Kahoo. Hey.
Good job, Artie.
Thank you.
Good job, Artie. Congratulations to Artie, Warris, and Kahoo. Now let's dive into the 5 advanced SLO practices with everyone's SLO definition solidified in their minds. First one is error budget policies. So what happens when you have an error budget of, say, 30 minutes per month, and then in the middle of the month, you have a sudden huge outage that took out 2 hours of downtime? Now what happens? You've broken the error budget. What do? Well, you ideally, before that happens, when you hit half of that budget, so let's say you've spent 15 minutes so far, someone gets notified, and maybe the VP of engineering gets notified, maybe the SRE team gets notified, and they look at all of the existing unfinished postmortems so far and see, okay, can we finish on postmortems? Are there open action items from those recent postmortems that we can complete? The error budget policy is when you reach a certain, when you've consumed a certain percentage of the error budget, it triggers an action, whether that's just an alert or something for you to look at. Okay, should I reprioritize my engineering work differently? Now, a lot of companies will implement this, which is when you completely consume your error budget, what then happens? Well, there's this term called code yellow. Code yellow is essentially a code freeze. So when you've hit your error budget, going any more or consuming any more error budget will cause your customers to be very unhappy. And this is where you freeze new feature development and work on any outstanding reliability tasks.
Can I add to that real quick, Christina? So in practice, what we found is that folks will, again, this policy may be defined inside a wiki page. This policy may be defined inside an Excel sheet. There needs to be some level of ownership around it. Once you've defined these error budget policies, the idea is that, well, once you've defined an SLO, the SLO by itself gives you a pretty passive view into the world, but how do you make it actionable? And that's where policies come into play. And some actions that we've seen companies from the field really do is that when you are close to violating or consuming your error budget, or for example, another criteria is the rate at which you're consuming your error budget, to kick off notifications or to prevent deployments from going on automatically. So you could have some sort of automated mechanism that's reaching out into your CI/CD pipeline to prevent those things from going out. And of course, another way of doing policies, another policy you may want to put in place is start an incident if I've consumed 70% of my error budget in like the first week of this 28-day period window that I'm measuring in.
And keep in mind that if you consume too much more than your error budget, you could actually violate your SLAs, which is a contract with customers. And when that happens, financial penalties will apply. And there are certain contracts that we've seen that has millions of dollars of penalties.
Yep. Talk to AWS. See. And if anybody remembers the GitHub outages and all that stuff. Great. So the other one is, how do you, once you have an SLO, what's consuming my SLO? That's the first question that gets asked. Well, the question is stemming from what's changing in my environment. Clearly, things are changing as quickly as possible, especially in a world where you're doing continuous delivery, you're deploying multiple times during the day. Many, many different systems are changing at the same time. Well, how do you start tying them back to SLOs and SLO violations? And bridging that gap we found is extremely impactful when it comes to making a decision on what to roll back, what type of application do we want to slow down, which team really needs to focus on doing their postmortems or doing their, focusing their efforts on reliability work. So it's really important to understand what your change sets are and tying back those changes to what, SLO violations that are happening.
Third one is giving back error budget. So I got a great question from someone at the SRECon booth who said, what if my downstream dependency service gets a huge outage and it burns down my SLO? Or what if my SLO gets completely burned out in the middle of the month and I still have 15 days to go and I really do want to do feature development? This is where someone can have the permission and access control to give back error budget, because error budget or error budget policy is not there to penalize, it's there to help protect the company's customer service. And so if you have resolved the incident and you're back online, everything is good to go, it's perfectly fine to restore the error budget and continue shipping new features.
Another use case that we've seen when it comes to giving the error budget back is downtime and maintenance windows. Well, you can decide to say, you can do some sort of ninja math to try and figure out, okay, I'm scheduling a downtime for 3 hours at 3 a.m. in the morning, and then I want to take that out preemptively from my error budget. Or you can say, it's okay for it to consume my error budget. I'm going to press a button, or I'm going to override that request and say, give the error budget back after the downtime window to that particular application or team. So we've seen that as well. This is one of my personal favorite ones, which is treating SLO violations as an incident. What we found is that, incident management is a pretty mature practice. There's a set of processes internally, tools put in place, and folks have a ready playbook that they put into play when an incident happens. Well, what if we treated an SLO violation as an incident, right? That can actually kick off a bunch of internal workflows that will help resolve that issue as quickly as possible, bring visibility into that issue upfront, proactively, and send communications out to the right folks. So everything that falls within your incident management practice today when an SLO violation happens, you can actually treat that as an incident. And that's something that we're seeing out in the field as well.
Can you give an example of an SLO violation? Is it the minute level violation? Or?
Right. So just to clarify, in terms of SLO violation that's happening on a minute level for that particular day, or my global error budget violation. So we're talking about global error budget violation. And the thing that really triggers this is what we've seen is the rate at which the SLO violation is happening. So this is where if you're consuming your error budget for the month at a rapid rate, then you should probably treat that as an incident and start kicking in the incident management workflow.
And in case you haven't noticed, that cartoon is a an image of a fireman. And really, we've seen parallels between SREs and firefighters. But deep down inside, your true colors are showing. I really think you're like Superman. It's unfortunately not the most glamorous at times, which is why having visibility through your performance or increased performance against SLOs can be really helpful.
Great. And then the last one, composite SLOs. This is a really recent concept. We've talked to a few companies, particularly very advanced SLO practitioners. The question that gets asked is, I have a user journey that has an availability SLO associated with it and a latency SLO associated with it. Well, should we treat those two as distinct things? Well, the answer is no, because would you be okay with your application being available 10 out of 10 times, but being fast only 3 out of 10 times, right? Or responsive only 3 out of 10 times. Or let's say that your application is able to respond 10 out of 10 times within 100 milliseconds, but is only available 50% of the time. So composite SLOs is a concept of combining the availability and latency and maybe quality SLOs all into one and treating it as a collective pool of SLO and error budget. And the thing that is contributing to that SLO and error budget is the weakest link in that, or the slowest mover, or the one that is the particular SLO that is not set up for success in this case, right? So out of the 3, you could have 4 nines for availability, 2 nines for latency, 5 nines for quality. Well, your collective composite SLO is actually 2 nines. Great. So in summary, we did an intro to SLOs and error budgets, and hopefully, as we saw through the quiz, folks did pretty well. We went through the exercise of choosing good SLIs and setting targets, the SLI equation, the 4-step process, and the really emphasis on user experience. And we talked about advanced SLO practices, error budget policies, tying back changes to SLOs, and composite SLOs. Our next workshop is going to be at the end of June, where we're going to go into some really deep advanced incident management practices, particularly tapping into the experiences from folks that have been real life incident commanders at events like Burning Man or our certified FEMA incident commanders, and how that set of practices is now applying itself into the field of SRE, right?
And we have 10 minutes for Q&A. So if you unmute your mic, feel free to ask any questions and we're here to answer.
I have a question.
Great.
Are you able to hear me? Okay.
Yes, we are.
I recently set an SLO on a service that we just rolled out based upon previous performance, just so we had a baseline of what's achievable. And it's conservative enough that we're not violating our SLO. However, I am aware that if we were more aggressive with the SLO, or rather if we were able to shift the underlying SLI to the metrics that drive the SLI, which determines the SLO, if we were able to drive that, it's a freshness SLO, that to be better, it would have a large business impact. How do you model an SLO that you're able to meet and is acceptable for now, but you would gain a lot of benefit if you were able to tighten it? Is that done? Do you walk SLOs in over time?
You mean, you're talking about tightening the SLOs? Well, that's a really interesting use case. So I'm assuming, this is a big assumption here, is that when you say that it's going to have an impact on the business, it's assuming a positive impact, right?
Correct. Having a better, having this service have fresher data would be a large efficiency gain for the company.
Right. Yeah, and that's a really excellent use case. We'd love to talk to you after this call as well to understand that in a little bit more depth. The typical one we've seen is actually the the converse of that, which is we want to tighten up the SLO because it's going to actually have the opposite effect, which is that it's going to actually make us better at responding, or we're so the SLA is too closely tied to the SLO, for example. So we want to actually provide a bigger gap. Is kind of what we've seen. I think this use case is actually one of the first ones I've heard where the efficiency gain is actually really having a positive impact on the business. I guess the question that I would have in that case is, how did you go about making that business case? How did you tie the business impact in terms of efficiency gain and how it's going to potentially help with your revenue or expense numbers or whatever it is, and to the SLO? Could you talk a little bit more about that for the benefit of the audience?
To a degree.
Yeah, please.
It is based upon how quickly we are able to perform a very large suite of tests. And the faster we can use these tests, the faster other developers can iterate on their work. And so these tests are blocked until this data is available for the tests, and a tighter freshness on the scale that we're at would have even if we were 1 minute more fresh instead of 3 minutes or whatever, that would be decidedly faster if every developer's test, of which there were many of, ran 1 minute faster.
So SLOs certainly changed. There are companies that actually schedule in SLO reevaluation periods in, say, every 6 months or every year. Because as we mentioned earlier, the reason we don't want people to set SLOs too high from the beginning is to not feel discouraged. And if you're consistently outperforming your SLO, then maybe you can raise it. Then maybe then it's the time to raise the bar. And another thing is, the reason we don't want people to do more reliability than they need is because it's very expensive and it might not be worth the impact. But from what we can hear, it sounds like there's tangible impact and that the return on investment could be really good. So it's about working out that cost-benefit analysis.
Actually, there is one use case that comes to mind, which is, the SLO, again, is supposed to be an objective internal measure. And what we found is that what we've seen some use cases is that you go from one SLA number inside this contract that you're putting into place to almost like a menu option of SLOs that you're going to put into a contract when you're defining an SLA. What we've seen is that a lot of legal teams, when thinking about risk and financial impact to violating these SLAs, are now using the SLOs to inform what those SLAs are and actually tweak those numbers accordingly. Right? That's the closest example in terms of financial impact, where the legal team is now empowered to look at this data and then appropriately inform the SLA, the external customer facing SLA, so that it's not just the generic, Google had an outage, a couple of weeks ago, impacted a bunch of customers. They had an uptime SLA of 99.99%. Obviously for the user, that's great. Not so great for Google because it's such a wide bucket. Well, with SLOs, they can actually really narrow down and say, okay, within this action where you're trying to spin up a VM, this was the specific thing that's broken, or your load time on your web application was broken, but the load time of the VM was not broken. So that menu option is actually helping on the financial obligation side of things.
Hey, and this is Kit. I got maybe an idea for whoever was speaking. So what if you had defined like another SLO that was just measuring, what you want to achieve, and then you were able to sort of like do some trending or like some analysis after the fact and say, hey, we met our target SLO, but we received X benefits when we met this sort of extra SLO. Would that help you?
The situation's a little different. We're meeting our SLO because we set it based upon past data and things that we thought we could consistently achieve without being too crazily conservative. But the problem is I'm worried that we won't have motivation if we're always hitting our target, but just barely. We won't have motivation to push our freshness to a tighter goal because we're always meeting our SLO. That's fine, there's no problem. Even if we're just narrowly meeting it, but we're consistently meeting it, that's great.
What if you did like, what if your SLO is like an average and then of the previous month? So if you meet it, then the next month is just kind of like dynamically a little bit tighter because the previous month was better, like the average was reduced. So maybe you had like an algorithm there on the SLI portion to actually, have the functionality you're after.
Something that something that could be helpful to think about is that SLO measures user happiness. So are users happy, or will users be dramatically happier if the freshness rate can increase? If so, then it is worthwhile to tighten the SLO so that you can drive better performance. And that can also become a competitive advantage for your company as well.
Yeah, it sounds like, you know, from just the example, and I'm taking a lot of liberty here, you're maybe in the CI space, where the velocity of the, you know, changes and pushes going out is actually directly correlated to you as a company being successful or not. And those are metrics that then go, I think that's a really powerful and unique use case. I think this approach is really great for that type of application because there's such a tight correlation between the SLO tightening and direct impact to the business, right? Where if your systems are doing more and more changes are going out, that's actually better for your company, even from a competitive aspect, because you have objective data that you can then present to your prospects and say, look at this objective data. We can actually push, you know, 5x or 10x more changes than our closest competitors. The only thing, the caveat here is that I think that's a pretty unique use case only because of the way that you've described it. In other scenarios, I do think the idea has a lot of merit, which is how do you actually give people the control and be able to see, hey, if we were to slide this SLO into this region or into this region or up or down or left or right, this is the impact that it's going to have on, you know, my business or my user happiness, and those two things can be tied together. What I'd be interested to see is when you're moving that SLO left or right, tightening it or loosening it, how does it impact the number of customer support tickets that are coming in or customer support tickets that are going in? Because that's a pretty common use case, measure that a lot of enterprise companies use to measure user happiness. NPS score is another one.
Well,
cool.
happy to chat offline after. We have time for 2 more questions. Anyone? And thanks for
thank you for
contributing, Kit.
I heard a Kit, and then who was the other gentleman?
Devin. Yeah,
Devin? Okay,
Devin
great.
asked a question and Kit contributed. Yeah. Thank you, guys.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, we have 2 questions. Very exciting.
Go ahead.
All right, mine's really quick. Earlier you guys talked about like valid metrics. I forget it was valid SLI or something like that.
Valid events versus success events?
Yeah, so the success ones. When you say valid, what about synthetic events? Would they be valid, or is it just user-facing ones that actually touch the user?
That's a really great question. It all depends on your SLI spec. So the SLI spec would say that my prober, my synthetic event, is part of that user experience. So if you've defined it to say, you know, I'm measuring these prober requests as part of my SLI specification, then yes. At the end of the day, it would still be your choice. And I'm assuming that you've built this prober or built this external synthetic check to capture user experience, you know, to reflect that user experience. So my recommendation is that yes, it should be, because if your probers are you know, catching that error or seeing that error, then it's likely that your customers are experiencing it. So I would say you start with including them, and then over time you refine it and decide that, okay, maybe this prober is no longer valid and it's going to change.
All right, cool.
There was another question.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Where's the chat?
Reading it out. Let's see if we can find that real quick. And if not, here we go. Chat.
Yeah, I don't know if that's the one I posted.
Can someone read it, please?
My name is Gene. It's basically, I missed part of the presentation, but I was trying to see if there's any practices where SLO and SLI are utilized for governance or governance tactics within the organization, or to help with governance.
Governance from, do you mean governance from a legal perspective, from a compliance perspective? How are you thinking?
I actually, it's just a thought I threw out there. It's not something that I'm covering within the organization, but I just figured I'd ask for another colleague.
Right.
But you know, that I wanted to get them on board for this particular topic because I think it would be of interest to them. But it's something I could circle back around to.
Please do, and I'll make 2 quick comments on that. Right, from a governance perspective, and I'm assuming governance is a pretty big bucket. Let's talk about compliance, for example. compliance and legal. Well, part of your ISO or SOC 2 or whatever compliance you're going through, they're going to talk about business best practices, incident management, whether you have SLAs or not. That is an area which really affect, where SLOs and SLIs and air budgets can be part of the discussion when you're going out to auditors and you to provide evidence about, hey, show us how you've been performing over time, show us your disaster recovery plan, whether it was successful or not, your DR exercises, are they successful or not? That's where SLOs and air budgets can really come in terms of an immediate use case. But of course, I'd love to hear a little bit more about that from a governance perspective. And of course, auditability when you kick off incidents through SLO violation. So.
All right, cool, thanks.
And that concludes the hour and our first workshop on SLOs. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. The recording will be available, is that right?
Yeah.
Great, yes, the recording will be available for folks to look at offline as well.
Have a great weekend.
Appreciate it, guys. Very helpful.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.